Welcome back to the channel. Today we drift into a darker chapter of the past, into the everyday lives that history rarely celebrates but never forgets. This is not the story of kings or crowns, but of ordinary people and the homes they struggle to survive in. If you're fascinated by the hidden realities of history, the lives lived behind closed doors, and the truths buried beneath romantic legends, you're in the right place. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more deep immersive journeys into the past. Now let's step back in time and uncover why life was truly brutal for homeowners in Tudor England. When we speak of owning a home, our modern imagination fills the space with ideas of safety, permanence, and dignity. We think of a place where doors can be closed against the world, where stability is built brick by brick, and where the future feels at least somewhat predictable. But to project these assumptions backward into Tudor England is to misunderstand the very nature of survival in that age. For a homeowner living between the late 15th and early 17th centuries, a house was not a symbol of comfort. It was a fragile line of defense against a world that was harsh, unstable, and often merciless. To live through the Tudor period was to exist in an England still shaking off the long shadows of medieval life. The Wars of the Roses had only recently ended, leaving deep scars in the countryside and a population exhausted by violence and uncertainty. The Tudor monarchs promised order, but for ordinary people, order came at a cost. Law was rigid, authority was absolute, and survival depended on obedience, labor, and endurance. Owning a home did not lift a person above these pressures. In many ways it made them more vulnerable. For the Tudor homeowner, the house was not merely a place to live. It was an economic unit, a workplace, a storehouse, and a public statement of status. It tied its owner to taxes, obligations, and legal responsibilities that could not be ignored. To possess a house meant to be visible, and visibility in Tudor England was dangerous. The crown could see you, the church could see you, your neighbors could see you, and once seen, you could be judged, accused, fined, or ruined. Unlike today, ownership rarely meant full control. Many homeowners did not truly own the land beneath their feet. They held it through complex systems of tenure, owing rent or service to a landlord, a noble, or the crown itself. A missed payment or a change in royal policy could strip a family of a home they had lived in for generations. Stability was an illusion maintained only as long as power allowed it. The Tudor world was one where the individual counted for very little against authority. Kings and queens ruled by divine right, and their needs came before those of their subjects. When the crown needed money for war, palaces, or political maneuvering, taxes were raised without consultation. Homeowners were expected to pay, regardless of hardship. Failure was not interpreted as misfortune, but as defiance. Life itself was precarious. The population lived close to the edge of subsistence, and most homeowners had little in reserve. A bad harvest could push a household into hunger. A sudden illness could remove the only wage earner. A minor injury could end a livelihood forever. In such conditions, owning a home did not provide security. It increased the stakes. A renter could flee. A homeowner was trapped by responsibility. The Tudor mindset was deeply shaped by fear. Fear of God, fear of authority, fear of neighbors, and fear of sudden disaster. Homes were not private sanctuaries in the modern sense. They were exposed spaces, open to inspection and judgment. Local officials could enter to ensure laws were being followed. Church authorities could investigate moral behavior. Neighbors could report suspicious activity, and accusations carried enormous weight. Reputation was everything. A homeowner whose house appeared neglected could be assumed to be immoral, lazy, or dangerous. Cleanliness, order, and conformity were not merely personal choices, they were survival strategies. To stand out was to invite scrutiny, and scrutiny often led to punishment. For women, the burden of homeownership was especially heavy. Widows who inherited property faced a hostile legal and social environment. While they might legally own a house, Their authority was often challenged by male relatives, neighbors, and officials. A woman living alone in her own home could be viewed with suspicion, her independence interpreted as unnatural or threatening. In extreme cases, property-owning women became targets for false accusations, including charges of witchcraft. Children, too, were shaped by the brutal reality of the household. Homes were places of work, not nurture. From a young age, children were expected to contribute to the household economy, learning trades, performing labor, and preparing for a life defined by struggle. There was little separation between home and hardship. They grew up watching parents worry over rent, taxes, food, and survival, absorbing the constant anxiety that defined Tudor domestic life. The house itself was often the family's only asset. Tools, goods, and savings were stored within its walls. If the house was lost, everything was lost. There were no banks to protect savings, no insurance to rebuild after disaster. A single event could reduce a homeowner to homelessness and begging, a fate that Tudor society treated with cruelty rather than compassion. Homelessness was not seen as a social failure, but a moral one. Those who lost their homes were often labeled as vagrants, a dangerous class in the eyes of the state. Tudor laws against vagrancy were harsh, including whipping, branding, and forced labor. The fear of falling into this category haunted homeowners constantly. The house was not just shelter, it was protection against being criminalized for poverty. Owning a home also meant being tied to the local community in ways that were both supportive and oppressive. Villages and towns operated on systems of mutual responsibility, where everyone was expected to police one another's behavior. If a crime occurred, the entire community could be punished. If a poor person starved, questions would be asked about who had failed in their duty. Homeowners were expected to contribute to local poor relief, even when they themselves were struggling. This sense of collective surveillance created an atmosphere of constant tension. Disputes between neighbors could escalate into legal battles that drained resources and destroyed reputations. Boundaries, noise, animals, waste, and behavior were all potential sources of conflict. In a world without privacy, the home offered little refuge from social pressure. The Tudor period was also marked by profound religious upheaval. The English Reformation transformed not only churches but homes. Religious practices that were once acceptable became illegal overnight. Objects that once symbolized faith became evidence of treason. Homeowners could be punished for what they kept within their walls, for the prayers they whispered, or for the books they owned. Houses became dangerous spaces during these shifts. A Catholic symbol hidden in a cupboard or a Protestant text left in plain view could bring severe consequences depending on who ruled at the time. Neighbors might inform on one another to protect themselves or gain favor. The home, instead of being a place of spiritual refuge, became a potential crime scene. All of this existed within a broader environment of instability. Tudor England was not a peaceful, settled nation. It was a land of recurring rebellion, war, and fear of invasion. From threats posed by foreign powers to uprisings at home, uncertainty was constant. Homeowners lived with the knowledge that soldiers could arrive, laws could change, and lives could be upended with little warning. In this world, endurance became a way of life. People did not expect comfort or happiness from their homes. They expected survival. Each day the house still stood, each night the family slept under its roof, was a small victory against forces that seemed always on the verge of collapse. To own a home in Tudor England was to accept a lifelong burden. It meant constant vigilance, endless labor, and unrelenting anxiety. It meant living with the understanding that safety was temporary and loss was always near. The house was not a refuge from the world, but a place where the world pressed in from every side. This is the reality often hidden beneath romantic images of Tudor England. Behind the timber frames and flickering hearth fires were lives defined by pressure, fear, and resilience. Homeownership did not elevate people above suffering, it bound them tightly to it. And it is only by understanding this harsh truth that we can begin to grasp what life was truly like for those who lived and died within the walls of Tudor England's homes. A Tudor house, from the outside, might appear charming to the modern eye. Timber beams crisscrossed with dark lines, whitewashed walls, overhanging upper floors, and a steep thatched roof all seem to belong to a picturesque past. But this image is a deception. For the people who lived inside these houses, beauty was irrelevant. What mattered was whether the structure could keep out the rain, resist collapse, and provide enough shelter to survive another season. Comfort, privacy, and health were luxuries far beyond reach. Most Tudor homes were constructed using materials that were cheap, local, and impermanent. Stone was expensive and reserved for churches, castles, and the houses of the very wealthy. Ordinary homeowners relied on timber frames filled with wattle and daub, a mixture of woven sticks coated with mud, straw, animal dung, and lime. This mixture cracked easily, absorbed moisture, and crumbled with age. Walls had to be constantly repaired, and neglect could quickly lead to structural failure. Owning a house meant endless maintenance, often carried out with bare hands and minimal tools. The roofs were usually made of thatch, layered thickly with straw or reeds. Thatch provided some insulation, but it was also highly flammable, easily damaged by storms, and a perfect nesting ground for insects, birds, and rodents. Rain could seep through if the roof was poorly maintained, soaking the interior and turning floors into mud. Snow added weight that could cause collapse. Every season brought a new threat, and the homeowner lived with the knowledge that nature itself was an enemy. Inside, the layout of a Tudor house reflected survival rather than comfort. Many homes consisted of a single main room, often called the hall, where nearly all daily life took place. Cooking, eating, working, and sleeping all happened in the same space. Wealthier homeowners might have additional chambers, but even these were small, dark, and sparsely furnished. There was no concept of specialized rooms designed for rest or privacy. Space was dictated by necessity, not well-being. The floor was often bare earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw. These rushes absorbed moisture, food scraps, and human waste, quickly becoming filthy. Over time, layers of dirt and debris built up, creating an environment that was damp, cold, and foul-smelling. Cleaning was difficult, and replacing floor coverings was labor-intensive. The result was a home that was never truly clean, no matter how hard its occupants worked. Windows, when they existed at all, were small and poorly designed. Glass was rare and expensive, so most windows were left open or covered with oiled cloth, wooden shutters, or animal horn. These provided minimal protection from wind and rain and almost none from cold. In winter, icy air poured into the house, making warmth nearly impossible to maintain. In summer, the same openings allowed flies and insects to swarm inside. Heating was primitive and dangerous. The heart of the Tudor home was the open hearth, usually located in the center of the main room. There were no modern chimneys in many early Tudor houses, only a hole in the roof through which smoke was meant to escape. In practice, much of it stayed inside, filling the house with thick, choking fumes. Eyes burned, lungs suffered, and walls turned black with soot. Respiratory illnesses were common, and long-term damage was unavoidable. Even when chimneys became more common later in the Tudor period, they were poorly constructed and required constant maintenance. Blockages could force smoke back into the house, while cracks could allow sparks to ignite the roof. Firewood was expensive and often in short supply, meaning homeowners had to ration heat carefully. Many endured winter nights wrapped in clothing, huddled together, their breath visible in the air. Furniture was minimal and functional. A table, a few benches or stools, and perhaps a chest for storage might constitute the entire household's possessions. Beds, when available, were simple wooden frames with straw mattresses that attracted insects and quickly became foul. Sheets and blankets were rough, rarely washed, and shared by multiple family members. Sleep was uncomfortable, interrupted, and never truly restful. Lighting after sunset was dim and unreliable. Candles were costly, so most households relied on rushlights, dried reeds dipped in animal fat. These provided weak illumination and produced smoke and an unpleasant smell. Once darkness fell, activity slowed, not because people were tired, but because the home could not safely support much movement or work at night. Accidents were common, and a dropped light could start a fire within moments. Ventilation was poor, and the air inside a Tudor house was thick with smoke, moisture, and odor. Cooking smells mixed with human waste, animal presence, and decaying organic matter. Many homeowners kept animals close to the house or even inside during cold weather, adding to the stench and filth. Pigs, chickens, and goats were not just livestock, they were survival assets, and their presence inside the home was often unavoidable. Water was another daily struggle. Most houses did not have direct access to clean water. Homeowners relied on wells, rivers, or communal pumps, which were often contaminated. Water had to be carried by hand, a physically demanding task that consumed time and energy. Once inside, it had to be used sparingly. Bathing was rare, not only because of social attitudes, but because heating enough water was impractical. The home offered no relief from dirt, it trapped it. Waste disposal was primitive. There were no indoor toilets. Chamber pots were used and emptied into pits, streets, or nearby waterways. In towns, waste accumulated quickly, seeping back into homes through damp walls and floors. In rural areas, pits overflowed in contaminated water sources. The homeowner was responsible for managing this waste, yet had few effective tools to do so. Structural safety was another constant concern. Timber frames weakened over time, especially when exposed to moisture and pests. Insects bored into wood, rodents gnawed supports, and rot spread silently. A house could partially collapse without warning, injuring or killing its occupants. Repairs required skill and resources that many homeowners lacked, forcing them to live with constant risk. Noise was unavoidable. Thin walls offered no soundproofing. Every movement, argument, cough, or cry echoed through the house and into neighboring homes. Privacy was non-existent. Emotional stress was intensified by the inability to escape others, even for a moment. The house did not shield its occupants from each other, it pressed them together under strain. Despite all this, the Tudor homeowner was expected to take pride in their dwelling. A poorly maintained house reflected badly on its owner, regardless of how difficult maintenance might be. Crumbling walls or a sagging roof invited criticism, suspicion, and even legal consequences. The house became a visible measure of moral worth, turning structural decay into social judgment. Seasonal changes shaped daily life inside these walls. Winter brought cold, darkness, and hunger. Summer brought heat, insects, and rot. Autumn meant dampness and decay, while spring revealed the damage left behind by the colder months. The house was never a stable environment. It shifted constantly, demanding attention, labor, and sacrifice. To live in such a structure required physical resilience and mental endurance. Every task, repairing walls, replacing thatch, fetching water, cleaning filth, was labor-intensive and repetitive. There was no escape from the cycle. The home did not reduce hardship, it concentrated it within a confined space. Modern notions of home as a place of comfort and rest simply did not exist for most Tudor homeowners. The house was a tool, not a refuge. It was something to be managed, endured, and defended against the elements. Survival depended not on how pleasant it was, but on whether it could hold together long enough to protect those inside. Behind the romantic facade of Tudor architecture lay a reality of cold rooms, smoky air, constant dampness, and relentless labor. These houses did not cradle their occupants, they tested them. And every day a homeowner woke up beneath a thatched roof and timber beams was another day won against a world that offered little mercy. Fire and disease were not distant threats in Tudor England, they were ever-present companions, woven into the fabric of daily life. For homeowners, the fear of sudden death or total ruin was not abstract or exaggerated. It was real, immediate, and constant. Every flame lit inside a house carried danger, and every breath drawn within its walls carried risk. Survival depended not on comfort or safety, but on luck, vigilance, and endurance. Fire began as a necessity. Without it there was no warmth, no cooked food, and no light after sunset. The Tudor home revolved around open flames, hearth fires, candles, rushlights, and glowing embers that never fully died. These flames burned in houses constructed almost entirely from combustible materials. Timber frames, thatched roofs, wooden floors, straw bedding, and fabric hangings created an environment where fire did not merely spread, it exploded. The open hearth was often placed in the center of the main room, with no barrier between flame and living space. Sparks leapt freely, landing on rushes, clothing, or wooden furniture. Chimneys, when they existed, were poorly built and frequently clogged with soot. Many houses had no chimney at all, relying instead on holes in the roof to release smoke. In such conditions, fires were not rare accidents. They were inevitable disasters waiting for the right moment. At night, the danger intensified. Homeowners slept near dying embers to preserve warmth, knowing that a single gust of wind or falling spark could ignite bedding or floor coverings. Yet extinguishing the fire completely meant waking to bitter cold and darkness. This nightly gamble was unavoidable. Every household lived with the knowledge that sleep itself could be fatal. When a fire began, there was little anyone could do. Towns and cities were densely packed, with houses built close together and upper floors often jutting over narrow streets. Flames leapt easily from roof to roof. Buckets of water, passed hand to hand, were the only defense, and water sources were limited. There were no organized fire brigades, no alarms beyond frantic shouting, and no coordinated response. Entire neighborhoods could be destroyed within hours. For the homeowner, the aftermath of a fire was often worse than the event itself. There was no insurance, no state assistance, and no guarantee of rebuilding. Everything stored inside the house, tools, food, clothing, savings, was lost. Survivors might be left with nothing but ashes and debt. Some never recovered, slipping into poverty and homelessness, their former stability erased in a single night. Disease, unlike fire, worked silently. It did not announce itself with flames or noise. It crept through homes, spreading invisibly from body to body, room to room. Tudor England was a perfect breeding ground for illness. Houses were cramped, poorly ventilated, and filthy by modern standards. Clean water was scarce, waste disposal was primitive, and animals lived in close proximity to humans. The air inside a Tudor home was thick with smoke from the hearth, moisture from damp walls, and odors from decaying organic matter. Windows were small or non-existent, trapping polluted air inside. Lungs weakened over time, making people more susceptible to infection. Chronic coughing, eye irritation, and breathing difficulties were common, accepted as normal aspects of life. Rats and mice were constant companions. They nested in walls, thatch, and floor coverings, feeding on stored grain and household waste. Fleas thrived on these animals and on human bodies, spreading deadly diseases. Homeowners knew the presence of vermin was dangerous, but they had few effective means of control. Traps were crude, poisons unreliable, and cats offered only limited protection. Plague outbreaks haunted Tudor England, returning again and again in waves of terror. When plague struck, it did not discriminate by wealth or status, but homeowners were particularly vulnerable. Their houses trapped them inside confined spaces, increasing exposure to infected family members. Once illness entered a household, escape was difficult or impossible. There was no understanding of bacteria or contagion. Disease was often attributed to bad air, divine punishment, or astrological influence. Treatments ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting, herbal mixtures, and superstitious rituals provided little relief. Homeowners watched helplessly as loved ones weakened, knowing there was little they could do. Fear shaped daily behavior. When disease appeared in a town, neighbors avoided one another. Houses were marked, doors were closed, and families were sealed inside. Isolation, hunger, and despair followed. Some fled if they could, but homeowners were often unable to abandon their property. To leave a house unattended meant risking theft, seizure, or permanent loss. Staying meant risking death. Even common illnesses were dangerous. A simple infection, untreated and misunderstood, could become fatal. Injuries sustained inside the home, cuts, burns, falls, were constant risks. Cooking over open flames, working with sharp tools, and navigating uneven floors all carried danger. Without proper medical care, small accidents could end lives. Child mortality was devastatingly high. Homes offered no protection against the illnesses that swept through families. Children slept close together, sharing bedding and air. When disease struck, it spread rapidly among the young. Parents lived with a constant fear of loss, knowing that survival was uncertain and grief was common. The emotional toll of this environment cannot be overstated. Homeowners lived under relentless stress, knowing that disaster could strike without warning. Every smell of smoke raised alarm. Every cough sparked fear. Every unexplained fever carried the possibility of death. Anxiety was a permanent companion, shaping behavior and worldview. Religion offered both comfort and terror. Many believed disease and fire were expressions of divine will. A burning house or dying child was interpreted as punishment or a test of faith. Homeowners were urged to examine their moral behavior, increasing guilt and fear during times of crisis. Instead of reassurance, belief often intensified suffering. Public health measures were crude and harsh. In times of plague, authorities might order houses sealed, trapping entire families inside with the sick. Guards enforced quarantine, preventing escape. Food was sometimes delivered, sometimes not. Death inside these sealed homes was common, and survivors emerged traumatized, if they emerged at all. Fire and disease often worked together. After a fire destroyed homes, displaced families crowded into surviving houses, increasing the spread of illness. After plague reduced the population, neglected houses decayed, becoming even more dangerous. Each disaster fed the next, creating cycles of suffering that defined Tudor life. Despite this, life went on. Homeowners lit their fires each morning, cooked their meals, and slept beneath their thatched roofs. They did so not because they felt safe, but because there was no alternative. Risk was unavoidable, fear was normalized, survival depended on acceptance as much as effort. The Tudor house was not a shield against danger, it was a vessel in which danger accumulated. Flames burned within its walls, disease lingered in its air, death walked freely through its doors. Yet people endured, clinging to life with resilience forged by necessity. To understand this reality is to strip away romantic visions of the past. The Tudor home was not a cozy retreat from a simpler time. It was a place where danger was constant and survival was uncertain. For homeowners, every day lived within those walls was a victory against forces that could, at any moment, erase everything. This was the brutal truth of life shaped by fire and disease in Tudor England, a world where owning a home meant living permanently on the edge of catastrophe. For a Tudor homeowner, the weight of taxes and the reach of the law were as oppressive as cold winters or deadly disease. These were forces that did not arrive suddenly like fire, nor creep silently like plague. They were always present, pressing down day after day, shaping every decision and every fear. To own a house was to place oneself firmly within the grasp of authority, and once there, escape was nearly impossible. Tudor England was governed by a rigid hierarchy in which power flowed downward from the monarch, through nobles and officials, and finally onto ordinary people. Homeowners sat in a particularly exposed position within this system. They were visible, accountable, and fixed in place. A house could not move, and neither could its owner. This made homeowners ideal targets for taxation and regulation because they could be found, assessed, and punished with ease. Taxes in Tudor England were not regular or predictable in the way we understand them today. They were often imposed suddenly, in response to royal needs rather than public welfare. Wars were expensive, and Tudor monarchs waged them frequently. Whether fighting France, suppressing rebellion, or defending the realm against foreign threats, the crown required money, and it was the ordinary population that paid the price. Homeowners were expected to contribute regardless of their personal circumstances. Poor harvests, illness, or previous losses did not excuse failure to pay. Tax assessments were often based on outward appearance rather than actual wealth. If a person owned a house, it was assumed they had resources. This assumption could be disastrous. Many homeowners were asset-rich but cash-poor, their wealth tied up in the very structure they lived in. When money was demanded, they had little to give. Beyond royal taxes, there were numerous other financial obligations. Church tithes required homeowners to give a portion of their income to support the local parish. Local levies funded roads, bridges, and communal projects. Feudal dues might still be owed to landlords or lords of the manor. Each payment on its own might be manageable, but together they formed a relentless drain on already fragile household economies. Failure to pay was not treated as misfortune, it was treated as disobedience. The Tudor state did not see poverty as a condition to be addressed, but as a moral failing to be corrected. Homeowners who fell behind could face fines, confiscation of goods, or imprisonment. In extreme cases, their property could be seized entirely, reducing a once stable family to destitution. The legal system that enforced these rules was harsh, complex, and overwhelmingly biased in favor of authority. Laws were numerous and often contradictory, making it easy for homeowners to break them without realizing it. Ignorance was no defense. Courts did not operate on principles of fairness or compassion, but on obedience and deterrence. Homeowners were legally responsible not only for themselves, but for what happened within their houses. If a crime was committed under their roof, they could be held accountable. If a servant stole, the master might be punished. If an illegal gathering took place, the homeowner could be fined or worse. The house became a legal liability, a space where responsibility accumulated rather than dissolved. This burden extended to behavior as well as crime. Tudor authorities were deeply concerned with morality and order. Laws regulated everything from working hours to religious observance. Homeowners were expected to enforce these norms within their households. Failure to do so could bring suspicion and punishment. A house that appeared unruly or disorderly was assumed to harbor moral corruption. Justice in Tudor England was public and intimidating. Punishments were designed to shame as much as to penalize. Fines could ruin a household, while imprisonment removed the labor needed to sustain it. Public humiliation, stocks, pillories, or public whipping destroyed reputations that homeowners depended on for survival within their communities. Legal disputes were common and dangerous. Boundary disagreements, inheritance claims, unpaid debts, and accusations of misconduct could all end up in court. Legal proceedings were expensive and time-consuming. A homeowner drawn into a dispute might spend months or years fighting to protect their property, draining resources and energy. Victory was never guaranteed, especially when facing wealthier or more powerful opponents. Women homeowners faced even greater vulnerability under the law. While some women could own property, their legal rights were limited and often contested. Widows who inherited houses were frequent targets of exploitation. Male relatives, neighbors, or officials might challenge their ownership, assuming a woman could not properly manage property. The law offered little protection against such pressures. Religious law added another layer of danger. The Tudor period was marked by dramatic shifts in religious policy. Practices considered lawful under one monarch could become criminal under the next. Homeowners could be punished for what they believed, how they worshipped, or what religious objects they kept inside their houses. The home, once again, became evidence. Inspections were common. Officials might enter houses to check for illegal religious items, unlicensed activities, or violations of labor laws. Refusal could be interpreted as guilt. Compliance did not guarantee safety. Anything found could be used as grounds for punishment. Homeowners lived with the knowledge that their private space was never truly private. The law also controlled movement and labor. Homeowners were tied to their parish and expected to contribute to its upkeep. Leaving without permission could bring legal consequences. At the same time, they were required to work, either directly or by ensuring that members of their household were productive. Idleness was criminalized. A homeowner who appeared not to be working hard enough risked suspicion and punishment. Debt was another legal trap. Borrowing was common, as homeowners struggled to meet taxes and obligations. But debt laws were unforgiving. Failure to repay could result in imprisonment, even if the debtor was genuinely unable to pay. A homeowner imprisoned for debt could lose everything while confined, as their house fell into disrepair or was seized. The constant pressure of law and taxation shaped how homeowners thought and lived. Decisions were driven by fear rather than hope. Money was hidden rather than invested. Repairs were delayed because funds might be needed for sudden taxes. Generosity was risky. Trust was limited. Survival required caution, conformity, and silence. Community life, which might seem supportive from a distance, was often another tool of enforcement. Neighbors were expected to report wrongdoing. Informing could bring rewards or protection. As a result, suspicion flourished. A careless word, an unpaid fine, or an unconventional practice could quickly become a legal problem. Homeowners learned to watch themselves as closely as they watched others. The Tudor legal system did not aim to protect homeowners. It aimed to control them. Stability was enforced through fear, punishment, and obligation. Order mattered more than justice. Authority mattered more than human cost. The house, instead of being a shield, became an anchor that held its owner firmly in place while the weight of the state pressed down. Yet despite this relentless pressure, people endured. They learned to navigate the system, to pay when they could, to comply outwardly even when they suffered inwardly. Homeownership was not abandoned because it was dangerous, it was clung to because it was the last barrier between survival and ruin. To understand Tudor England is to understand this crushing relationship between property and power. Owning a home meant belonging to a system that demanded everything and gave little in return. It was a life lived under constant judgment, where the law was not a protector but a presence, watchful, unforgiving, and always ready to strike. This was the brutal reality faced by homeowners who lived not only within walls of timber and mud, but within an invisible prison of taxes, laws, and obligations that shaped every moment of their existence. Life inside a Tudor home was defined not only by hardship and danger, but by constant exposure. The walls were thin, the spaces were cramped, and the lives of those inside were never truly their own. Privacy, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. For homeowners, this lack of space and separation created relentless pressure, emotional, social, and psychological, that wore people down over years and generations. Most Tudor houses were small, even for families of modest size. A household rarely consisted of just parents and children. Servants, apprentices, extended relatives, and sometimes lodgers all shared the same confined space. This was not a choice born of generosity, but of necessity. Taking in others brought extra income, shared labor, or social obligation that could not be refused. Each additional person, however, increased strain on resources, space, and tempers. Sleeping arrangements reflected this crowding. Entire families slept in the same room, often in the same bed. Children shared straw mattresses on the floor. Servants slept wherever space could be found, near the hearth, under tables, or in lofts barely fit for storage. There was no separation between work and rest, between sickness and health. When one person fell ill, everyone was exposed. Noise was constant. Coughing, snoring, crying children, arguments, and the sounds of labor filled the house from dawn until night. Silence was rare. Emotional stress had no outlet because there was nowhere to retreat. Grief was shared publicly. Fear was witnessed by all. There was no private place to process loss or anxiety. The house magnified every emotion. This constant closeness intensified conflict. Minor disagreements became unavoidable confrontations. Domestic violence, though rarely recorded honestly, was a reality in many households. Stress, hunger, and exhaustion fueled anger, and there was little social intervention unless violence spilled into the public sphere. The home did not shield its occupants from harm. It often became the place where harm occurred. Beyond the physical crowding was the suffocating pressure of social observation. Tudor communities were tightly knit, and homeowners lived under the unblinking gaze of their neighbors. Everyone knew everyone else's business. The state relied on this visibility, encouraging people to monitor and report one another. The home was not hidden from society, it was on display. A homeowner's reputation was tied directly to the condition of their house. A crumbling wall, a broken door, or an unkempt yard invited judgment. It suggested laziness, disorder, or moral failure. Even when poverty or illness made maintenance impossible, excuses were rarely accepted. Appearance mattered more than circumstance. Cleanliness was not simply a matter of comfort, it was a moral expectation. Dirt, clutter, or disorder could provoke suspicion. Neighbors might assume criminal behavior, immoral conduct, or religious nonconformity. Rumors spread quickly, and once established, they were difficult to erase. A single accusation could lead to investigation, fines, or worse. Women bore the heaviest burden of this judgment. They were expected to manage the household, maintain order, and uphold moral standards. Failure reflected not only on them, but on the entire family. A woman who struggled due to illness, grief, or poverty was often blamed rather than helped. Her home became evidence of her worth. Widows faced particular danger. Owning a home without a husband made a woman visible and vulnerable. She might be accused of improper behavior, financial mismanagement, or even witchcraft. Her independence was seen as unnatural. The very house that represented survival could become the reason for her persecution. Children, too, were shaped by constant scrutiny. Their behavior reflected on the household. Misconduct could bring punishment not just to the child, but to the parents. As a result, discipline was harsh, driven by fear of public shame as much as by desire for order. Childhood was lived under pressure, with little space for play or emotional freedom. Lodgers and servants added another layer of risk. Homeowners were responsible for their actions. If a lodger committed a crime or a servant behaved improperly, blame often fell on the householder. Yet refusing to take in others could be economically disastrous or socially frowned upon. This created a dangerous balance between necessity and risk. Religious life intensified these pressures. During the Tudor period, shifts between Catholicism and Protestantism turned private belief into a public danger. Homes were searched for forbidden books, symbols, or practices. Neighbors listened for prayers, watched for unusual gatherings, and reported suspicions. A home that once held personal faith became a potential site of treason. The fear of being watched altered daily behavior. Homeowners learned to perform conformity. They attended church even when beliefs differed. They avoided speaking openly. They hid objects, suppressed opinions, and taught children silence. The house became a stage where safety depended on appearing acceptable. Social judgment extended beyond morality into class and ambition. A homeowner who appeared too prosperous might attract envy and suspicion. One who appeared too poor risked being labeled idle or dangerous. There was little room to exist comfortably between these extremes. Balance was essential but difficult to maintain. Community support, often romanticized, was conditional and limited. Help was offered only to those deemed deserving. A family that fell into hardship might receive assistance, but only under close scrutiny and often with humiliation attached. Charity came with judgment, reinforcing social hierarchies rather than easing suffering. Public shame was a powerful tool. A homeowner accused of misconduct could be exposed before the entire community. Stocks, church penance, or public apology were designed to humiliate. the memory of such events lingered long after punishment ended, shaping how families were treated for years. Inside the home, this pressure created an atmosphere of constant vigilance. People watched what they said, how they behaved, and how their house appeared from the outside. Emotional expression was dangerous. Silence and restraint were survival skills. Even celebrations were constrained. Weddings, feasts, or gatherings risked attracting attention. Excess could be criticized. Absence could be suspicious. Every action carried social meaning. The home was not a place of freedom, but a site of performance. Over time, this environment shaped identity. Homeowners learned to internalize judgment, policing themselves even when no one was watching. Fear became routine. Anxiety became normal. The house, instead of offering refuge, became the center of psychological strain. Yet within this pressure, people endured. Families adapted, endured overcrowding, navigated gossip, and learned to survive under constant observation. Resilience was not heroic, it was necessary. There was no alternative. The Tudor home was not simply a structure of wood and mud. It was a social arena where reputation, morality, and survival collided. Every crack in the wall, every raised voice, every shadow of suspicion mattered. For homeowners, life was lived under watchful eyes, in spaces too small to hide and too exposed to feel safe. This was the unseen brutality of Tudor domestic life, a world where the home did not protect individuality, but demanded conformity, silence, and endurance in exchange for survival. War, unrest, and sudden ruin were realities that hovered constantly over Tudor England, and for homeowners these threats carried a particular weight. A house anchored a family to a place, and that fixed position made them vulnerable whenever the wider world turned violent or unstable. Unlike soldiers or nobles, ordinary homeowners had little power to influence events, yet they bore many of the consequences. Their homes, built through years of labor and sacrifice, could be transformed overnight into sites of fear, loss, and irreversible change. The Tudor period was not an age of peace. England was frequently at war, either abroad or within its own borders. Conflicts with France, Scotland, and Spain drained the treasury and demanded manpower and resources from the population. At the same time, internal rebellions and uprisings erupted when political or religious tensions boiled over. For homeowners, these events were not distant matters discussed only by elites. They arrived at the doorstep, often quite literally. When armies moved, they did not travel empty-handed. Soldiers required food, shelter, and supplies, and these needs were often met by force. Homeowners could be ordered to house soldiers, a practice known as billeting. Refusal was not an option. To resist was to invite punishment, imprisonment, or worse. A home could be seized temporarily, turning private space into a military encampment. The arrival of soldiers brought chaos. These men were frequently unpaid or poorly supplied, and they took what they needed from the households forced to host them. Food stores were depleted, furniture damaged, tools broken, and personal possessions stolen. Women and children lived in fear, exposed to harassment or violence with little protection. The homeowner, powerless to intervene, watched the household economy collapse under the strain. Even after soldiers moved on, the damage remained. Crops might be trampled, animals stolen, and houses left in disrepair. There was no compensation. The Crown did not repay losses suffered in the name of national defense. Homeowners were expected to absorb the cost silently, even when it pushed them toward ruin. Rebellion brought its own dangers. Tudor rulers responded to uprisings with brutal force, punishing not only rebels but entire communities suspected of sympathy. Homes were searched, property confiscated, and families displaced. A homeowner's past associations, religious practices, or even careless words could become grounds for suspicion. In such times, neutrality was nearly impossible. Religious conflict added another layer of instability. The Tudor era saw dramatic shifts between Catholicism and Protestantism, each enforced with harsh laws. Homeowners were caught in the middle. Their houses became sites where forbidden beliefs might be hidden or exposed. A single object, a book, a symbol, a whispered prayer, could bring devastating consequences. Fear of informers was constant. Neighbors, servants, or even family members might report suspicious behavior to protect themselves or gain favor. A homeowner could be arrested, fined, or executed based on accusations rooted in rumor or misunderstanding. The home, once again, offered no protection. Its walls could not keep out authority. Economic ruin often followed political turmoil. Wars disrupted trade, increased taxes, and caused inflation. Prices rose while wages stagnated. Homeowners struggled to afford basic necessities, let alone maintain their houses. Debt became common, and debt was dangerous. Creditors showed little mercy, and imprisonment for debt could strip a family of its last means of survival. The absence of any safety net made these crises catastrophic. There was no state welfare, no disaster relief, and no insurance. Charity existed, but it was limited, conditional, and often humiliating. A homeowner who fell into hardship might receive minimal aid, but only under strict supervision, and with the constant threat of being labeled idle or undeserving. Loss of a home was not merely an economic failure, it was a social death. Without a fixed address, a person became a vagrant in the eyes of the law. Tudor vagrancy laws were severe, treating homelessness as a crime rather than a misfortune. Punishments included whipping, branding, and forced labor. The fear of falling into this category haunted homeowners constantly. Natural disasters compounded these dangers. Floods, storms, and harsh winters could damage houses and destroy livelihoods. A collapsed roof or washed-out wall required repairs that many homeowners could not afford. Delay invited legal trouble, social judgment, and further decay. The house, once damaged, became a liability rather than an asset. Old age was another silent threat. As homeowners grew older, their ability to maintain property and earn income declined. Without pensions or reliable support, elderly homeowners depended on family, charity, or community goodwill. Those without strong social ties faced neglect and poverty. The house that had once symbolized independence could become a burden too heavy to bear. Inheritance, often imagined as a moment of continuity, was frequently a source of conflict. Property disputes among heirs could tear families apart. Legal battles drained resources and left houses neglected. In some cases, the home was sold to pay debts, or divided until it lost all value. The idea of passing a house safely to the next generation was more fragile than it appeared. Through all of this, Tudor homeowners endured not because life was fair, but because there was no alternative. Survival required acceptance of uncertainty and suffering as normal conditions. Hope was modest and practical, to keep the roof standing, to avoid attention, to live through another year. The psychological toll of this existence was immense. Living under constant threat of loss shaped how people thought and behaved. Ambition was dangerous. Change was risky. Tradition and conformity became shields against chaos. The home was not a place of dreams, but a line of defense against a hostile world. Yet despite everything, people persisted. They repaired walls, rebuilt after fires, endured occupation, and navigated shifting laws. Their resilience was not romantic or heroic. It was quiet, worn, and born of necessity. Each surviving household represented countless compromises and sacrifices made to stay afloat. When we look back on Tudor England, it is easy to be distracted by royal intrigue, grand architecture, and dramatic events. But the true story of the era lies in the ordinary homes where people struggled daily against forces beyond their control. For homeowners, life was a constant balancing act between survival and collapse. Owning a home did not grant peace or security. It bound a person to a system that offered little mercy. War, law, economy, and society all pressed in on those timber walls. The house stood not as a symbol of comfort, but as a fragile barrier against a world that could at any moment take everything away. This was the final brutality of Tudor homeownership, the knowledge that no matter how hard one worked, no matter how carefully one obeyed, safety was never guaranteed. Survival was temporary, and endurance was the only lasting achievement. Even after enduring poverty, disease, social pressure, harsh laws, war, and the constant threat of ruin, there remained one final, quieter brutality in the life of a Tudor homeowner: the slow erosion of hope itself. This was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual wearing down of spirit, passed silently from one generation to the next. It was the realization that no matter how much effort was given, how carefully rules were followed, or how faithfully one worked, life would likely never improve in any meaningful way. For many Tudor homeowners, the future was not imagined as progress, but as repetition. Each year followed the same exhausting rhythm: repair the house, pay the dues, survive the winter, avoid attention, endure loss, and begin again. There was little sense of upward movement. Children did not dream of easier lives. They were trained to inherit hardship. A house was not a stepping stone toward prosperity, but a fixed point around which struggle revolved. This created a deeply conservative mindset, not political in the modern sense, but psychological. Change was dangerous. New ideas, new methods, or new ambitions carried risk. A homeowner who tried to improve their situation too visibly might attract envy, suspicion, or increased taxation. Success itself could be punished. As a result, people learned to limit their aspirations, to aim not for advancement but for invisibility. The home reinforced this mentality. Every crack in the wall, every sagging beam, every patch of damp reminded its occupants that decay was inevitable. Repairs never ended. They only delayed collapse. No matter how much labor was poured into maintaining a house, time and nature always gained ground. This constant battle against deterioration shaped how people viewed their own lives: temporary, fragile, and ultimately beyond control. Aging brought its own quiet cruelty. As homeowners grew older, the house that once represented independence became a physical burden. Roofs still needed repair, walls still needed reinforcing, and fuel still needed gathering, but strength faded. Without modern tools or assistance, even simple maintenance became exhausting. The house did not adapt to age, it demanded the same labor until the body failed. Elderly homeowners without strong family support were especially vulnerable. If children had died, moved away, or fallen into poverty themselves, the old were left alone with responsibilities they could no longer manage. Community help was limited and conditional. An aging homeowner who could not keep their house in good order risked judgment, neglect, and eventual displacement. Death, when it came, did not bring peace to the household. Funerals were costly, and burial fees placed additional strain on families already struggling. Inheritance disputes often followed, reopening wounds and creating new ones. The house, instead of uniting survivors, could become a source of conflict, resentment, and legal trouble. For those who survived into old age, memory itself became a burden. Many had lived through fires, plagues, wars, and religious upheaval. They had buried children, lost neighbors, and watched entire streets vanish. The house stood as a witness to these losses, filled with absences that could not be repaired. Every familiar corner carried reminders of those who no longer lived there. Mental health, though not recognized as such, suffered deeply under these conditions. Anxiety, despair, and emotional numbness were common, even if they were never named. Grief was frequent and unresolved. There was little space for mourning in a world that demanded constant labor. Life went on not because wounds healed, but because survival required it. Religion offered explanations, but not always comfort. While faith could provide meaning, it also reinforced guilt and fear. Suffering was often interpreted as deserved or divinely ordained. This belief discouraged resistance and encouraged acceptance of hardship as inevitable. For homeowners, the idea that life would always be difficult became not just a reality but a moral expectation. Children raised in these homes absorbed this worldview early. They learned that security was fragile, that obedience mattered more than happiness, and that endurance was more valuable than joy. Play was limited, education was rare. The house was a place where responsibility arrived too soon and stayed too long. Even moments of happiness were restrained. Laughter, celebration, and expression were carefully measured to avoid attracting attention or criticism. Excess was dangerous. Emotion was controlled. Over time, this produced a culture of restraint that blurred the line between discipline and despair. The ultimate cruelty was that this way of life was normalized. People did not see themselves as victims of an unjust system, because there was no visible alternative. Everyone around them lived the same way. Suffering became the baseline. The idea that life could be fundamentally different was difficult to imagine. From a modern perspective, it is tempting to admire the resilience of Tudor homeowners. And resilience they certainly had. But resilience born of necessity is not the same as resilience chosen freely. Endurance was not a virtue celebrated by choice, it was a condition imposed by circumstance. The house, in the end, symbolized this entire experience. It stood firm not because it was strong, but because it was constantly propped up by human effort. Its occupants lived the same way, held together by routine, habit, and determination, even as pressures mounted from every side. When we step back and look at Tudor England through the lens of ordinary homeowners, a different history emerges, not one of grandeur or progress, but of survival measured in years rather than generations. These were lives spent maintaining rather than advancing, enduring rather than escaping. And yet, without these people, history would have no foundation. Their labor supported towns, economies, and nations. Their houses formed the physical and social structure of Tudor England. Their quiet suffering made possible the world remembered in textbooks and monuments. To acknowledge the brutality of their lives is not to diminish their strength, but to understand it honestly. Their endurance was not romantic. It was exhausting, repetitive, and often unrewarded. They did not live in a golden age. They lived in a world that demanded everything and promised little. This final truth brings us full circle. To own a home in Tudor England was not to possess stability, comfort, or security. It was to accept a lifetime of responsibility without guarantee, effort without assurance, and hope carefully limited to survival. Behind every timber frame and thatched roof was a human story shaped by pressure, loss, and persistence. These homes did not shelter easy lives. They contained quiet battles fought every day against a world that rarely offered mercy. And it is in remembering these unseen struggles that we truly understand how brutal life was for homeowners in Tudor England. And that brings us to the end of today's journey into Tudor England, a world where owning a home was never simple, never safe, and never comfortable. The stories of these ordinary people remind us that history is not just about kings and battles. It is about the daily struggles, fears, and resilience of those who lived behind closed doors. If you found this dive into the past insightful, don't forget to like the video, share it with fellow history enthusiasts, and subscribe to the channel for more explorations into the hidden realities of history. Thank you for watching, and remember, every home has a story, and every story deserves to be remembered.